In the first week's lesson, I asked you to watch a video on YouTube as to how Walt Disney made films back in the 1950s. And you saw in that clip that they used frame-by-frame animation of drawing characters on celluloids that they referred to as cells, and then photographing them on a photo stand one frame at a time. You also saw the multi-plane camera that they used to create some special effects in terms of depth and animation. But it was still one shot, one frame at a time. And everything was drawn basically one frame at a time. Now, when you think about shorts, animation shorts, they're usually 6 minutes in length. They are 24 frames per second. So we're talking 60 seconds times 24 frames per second times 6. And you see there's a lot of frames that have to be photographed. Now each of those cells, or each frame, may be comprised of multiple cells. So you may have different cells for different characters. And each cell, again, is 1/24 of a second in length. So it's a very time-consuming process, and it employed a very large staff to create animated shorts and animation features. And there are ways to let Flash do some of the work for us, but we still need to do some frame-by-frame animation. And I'm going to start the process of teaching animation by teaching you the hardest way first, or the most time-consuming way, and then I'll show you some ways that we can do it faster. But I want you to understand frame-by-frame animation so that in those times when you need that process, you understand it. So I've created a new Flash project. I have a stage that is 550 by 400, the default size, and I've colored it kind of a periwinkle blue, and I've drawn a brown rectangle at the bottom, which is going to represent the table or a floor. And we're going to do an animation of a red ball bouncing up and down on this surface. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've created this layer and named it background that has this shape in it. And I'm just going to extend this down for now to about 75 frames. So I'm going to insert a frame. And for our purposes, the default is 24 frames per second. I'm going to reduce this down to 12 frames per second. That'll still give us a fairly decent animation, but it'll be a little less work than doing 24 frames. And for the purpose of this video, you'll still get a pretty good idea of how to do frame-by-frame animation. All right, I'm going to take my oval tool, and I'm going to create a new layer that I'm going to call ball. And I'm going to go ahead and lock the background layer so I can only work on the ball layer. And on the ball layer, I'm going to get a fill color of red. I'm going to draw my ball. And I'm going to double click on it. So select both the fill and the stroke. And then I'm going to convert it to a symbol and turn it into a movie clip. I'm just going to call it MC Ball. So I now have this object of a movie clip with my ball. I'm going to simply put it up here at the top. Actually, let's have it start partially on the stage. And that's my first keyframe. Now, a keyframe is where the contents of a layer have changed from the previous frame. If I right-click on frame 2, I can say Insert Keyframe, and I get another keyframe. Now, the two symbols here for the keyframe is a little circle, and there's two different keyframes. If it's a hollow circle, that means that it is an empty frame. So I'm going to convert this into a blank keyframe. And you'll notice I get a little hollow circle, and there's no contents on this frame. These two frames have contents. Now it just so happens that frame 1 and frame 2 are identically the same. And so I can have keyframes that don't necessarily change from the frame before, but the idea is I can change the contents of this frame from the frame before without altering the previous keyframe. So all I'm going to do on this keyframe is I'm going to drop this ball down, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click the down arrow, and that will move it 10 pixels at a time. So that's my keyframe. Now I'm going to come back to frame 3 and I'm going to clear that keyframe and then right click on it again and choose Insert Keyframe. Now number 3 is the same as number 2. This time I'm going to shift it down again 10 pixels. So shift down. And I want this thing to accelerate over time, so I'm going to nudge it an additional 2 pixels. I'm going to hit the down arrow twice. Then I'm going to insert another keyframe. So this is called frame by frame. I'm changing the contents every frame. This one I want to move 14 pixels. So shift down will be 10, and I'm going to nudge it down 4 times with the down arrow. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next keyframe. Insert a keyframe. This one I'm going to nudge down 10, and then 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I'm going to continue this process until I get the ball down to the bottom. So this one's 18. I'm actually going to go shift down twice, that's 20, and move it back up 2. Okay, next keyframe. I'm going to shift it down 20 pixels. (22 pixels). 24 pixels, and so forth. Okay, so I now have it down to the bottom of where I want it to bounce off the table. I'm going to do one more keyframe here. And this time I'm just going to nudge it down just basically about 6 or 7 times. And as part of this sequence, when our rubber ball hits the table, we want it to squish or squash. So it's going to change shape a little bit. If we were watching this with a high-speed, slow-motion camera, we'd actually see this happen to a red ball. In animation, we tend to exaggerate movements a little bit. But what I'm going to do is select my free transform tool, and I'm going to move my pivot point down here to the bottom so that I can begin to pull the ball down a little bit. And I want to keep the same mass. So to get the same mass, I also need to pull it out a little bit. Next keyframe. I'm going to insert a keyframe. So again, I'm going to squash it a little bit more. Pull it out a little bit more. And we'll do one more keyframe. And this will be the last of our squashing. And now I want to start to bounce back up. So in this next keyframe, I'm going to insert a frame, or insert a keyframe. And now I want to bring the ball back in and have it begin to return back to its normal shape and size. Insert another keyframe. And now as it leaves the table, we want to do the opposite of squashing it. We want to stretch it. So I'm going to insert a keyframe, and I'm going to bring this up more, bring the sides in a little bit more. Let's have it start to move off the table a little bit. I'm just going to nudge it up slightly. And then I'm going to insert another keyframe. And I'm going to, again, just stretch it even a little bit more, just kind of exaggerating that movement. But now I want to start to bring it back up off the floor. I'm going to go up about 8 or 9. And so now insert another keyframe. And here I'm going to move it up 10 pixels. But I'm also going to begin to return it back to its normal size of the red ball. Insert a keyframe. I'm going to move it up 10 and another 2. And stretch it back out to basically the size it was. And now I'm just going to simply continue to move the ball upwards. So I'm going to insert a keyframe. This time I'm going to go 14 pixels. It's going to accelerate as it's moving up. And you see this is indeed kind of time consuming. You can imagine if we had a character who was walking where the feet were at different positions, the arms were at different positions for each frame, we'd have a lot of drawing to do. Now, because of the pull of gravity, I'm actually going to start to slow this down a little bit. So I'm going to actually nudge it down on that last keyframe a few times. Now I'm going to go back to my first frame, and I'm going to bring up my rulers. So view, rulers, and I'm just going to put a ruler guide where the ball started. I'm in essence going to have it kind of return to that space. So it's going to perpetually bounce as we loop this. So in this next keyframe, I'm going to move it up just a little bit. And then I'll basically return it back to the starting position here. And I might want to have it pause there for a second or so, or for a couple frames, as it kind of reaches that spot of inertia. What I'm going to do here is get rid of these frames. So I'm going to go to the last frame, click, holding down the shift key, I'm going to click, let's go one more frame, and I'm going to right click and choose remove frames and get rid of those. I'm going to do the same thing with the table background. I'm going to remove those frames. And so you'll see on this very last frame I get a square for my frame. That just means it's the end of a frame sequence. This frame is no different from this frame, so it's going to pause there for a frame. In fact, I'm going to insert one more frame to let it just kind of pause and hang there just a little bit more. So now I've got a keyframe, I've got just a normal frame, and I've got an end frame. Really, all three of those frames are the same. I'm going to add a frame here, and that should be our animation. So I'm going to go to the control menu and test it. And there's our ball, and you notice how it comes down, squashes, and it stretches as it goes back up. Now it's probably a little slow. I could have that ball move more pixels at a time, but if I want to speed this up a little bit, I could simply come over to my stage and increase the frame rate. Maybe instead of 12, I want to do 18, and we'll test that. A little bit better, and I might actually want to do 24 and see how that speed works. That looks pretty good. So that is frame by frame animation. Next, we'll look at using a character in terms of having multiple movements in a walk cycle, or we're actually going to do a goose of a flight cycle.